My name is Elizabeth Fleetwood, and I am a secondary education major with concentrations in U.S. history, government, and geography. I also am currently working on a certification in English as a second language and have a minor in English. Over the last 10 weeks, I had the opportunity and privilege of teaching and learning at Clay High School. Each day, I taught 5 55-minute sections of freshman geography and history of the world. According to the Indiana Department of Education, the demographics of Clay High School resemble the demographics of South Bend Community School corporations. 47% of students are Caucasian, while 30% are African American, 10% Hispanic, and the remaining 10% identify as multicultural. 58% of students receive free meals, while 8% receive reduced meals, and about 33% of students have paid meals. The enrollment of the 2017 to 2018 year by free reduced price meals resemble the low socioeconomic status of the school. Since I was teaching 9th grade geography, I was curious to see how students exiting 9th grade were performing on the 10th grade I-STEP exam. What I found was that 78% of students did not pass the I-STEP in the 2016-2017 exam, which below the state and the national average, making Clay an underperforming school. Within my classroom, there was evidence of serious tracking. Each class was made up of students with similar abilities and behaviors. At times, I felt like I could group my classes and rank each class's abilities from 1 to 5, each class needing a different level of scaffolding. The demographics of my classroom influenced everything that I did, from planning to classroom management plans, to instructional strategies, and even employing discipline. All of these factors were crucial to ensuring student achievement and engagement. Right away, it was clear that the difference between my honors classes and my general education classes were so extreme that planning needed to include more than modifications to material or instruction. Oftentimes, lessons were differentiated entirely, including focusing on different aspects of the content, providing a more in-depth look at historical aspects in order to challenge the more advanced students' higher order thinking skills. Although I am often the free spirit in my personal life, I am very much so a planner when it comes to my work and my school life. So during Christmas break, I spent hours upon hours mapping out unit plans, researching materials and resources, and developing objectives that align with state standards. By the time I showed up on my first day, I had my whole unit planned with supplemental materials and resources ready to go. Even though at the time I felt like I had slaved over these plans, I quickly realized how essential planning is to being an effective teacher. I already had an end goal in sight and objective to meet, and it was ready to go. Along the way, there were some adjustments. Some lessons took a lot more time to plan. Some activities needed to be modified or lectures simplified in order to meet my daily objectives. However, by planning so far ahead, I was able to ensure that lessons were planned in a way that differentiated instruction and provided scaffolding and reinforcement. Having all of this planning done ahead of time gave me the freedom to give my full attention to the students during the day and relieve them from the stress of, what are we going to do tomorrow? I was able to place all of my attention to forming relationships with my students and formatively assessing their understanding, which allowed me to make adjustments to my plans to meet their needs. For example, the first unit that I taught was over Russia. While my general classes began the unit by doing guided readings over the physical geography and climate of Russia, my honors classes began reading a section of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. Like Janae, my cooperating teacher, I began the units by covering the physical geography and climate of the region, before moving into historical and political geography of the regions. However, my honors classes demonstrated through formative questioning for understanding and pre-assessments to have a grasp on the patterns of climate and geography. Therefore, I was able to spend time doing further in-depth with their critical thinking skills and introduce the Communist Manifesto to them. This too, however, was a challenge. I wanted to develop students' historical thinking skills, encourage them to think analytically, to recognize cause and effect relationships, as well as interpret and contextualize primary sources. So for my honors classes, I wanted them to read the Communist Manifesto in order to develop context and perspective of the time period that eventually shaped Russia, North Africa, and the Middle East, all of which I would cover during my time there. Most of what my students had been asked to demonstrate through assignments up to this point in their education was to identify, describe, explain, predict, etc. However, I wanted to focus on developing higher order thinking skills with my honors classes. Therefore, most of the questions in their reading guides were analytical. I asked students to highlight and label the part of the text that they would use to answer each question so that I could better assess their ability to analyze and make interpretations about text. I gave them an entire day in class to read and assigned the rest as homework. The next day, my students were in a panic. As we started the discussion, I realized that the text was overwhelming to them and we needed to modify. So we spent 3 full days in groups and collectively analyzing and breaking down the text, paragraph by paragraph. By the end of it, my students had demonstrated a strong understanding of the material through formative assessments as they revised their reading guides to make them more detailed and clear and participating in discussions. They later proved to be able to utilize this information in their summative exam, writing an essay linking Marx's ideas to the rest of the unit over Russia and communism. At the end of my time there, students were still talking about the manifesto and how they were able to reference it in other classes and use it in their work. One girl even mentioned how she couldn't play her video game without thinking about Karl Marx. This topic was built upon for the rest of the time I was student teaching as we introduced colonialism, neocolonialism, nationalism, independence, and current conflicts in North Africa and the Middle East. Because of the success I had with my honor students, I did not immediately recognize the confusion in my general classes as we began discussing the topic of communism and capitalism. Although they did not read the Communist Manifesto, I introduced them to Karl Marx and spent a day comparing capitalism to communism. After I began to ask students to volunteer in discussion by making interpretations and applying their understanding of capitalism and communism to the conflict of the time period, I realized that they were lost. I realized that the students did not have the same level of academic vocabulary or had not developed the higher order thinking skills, so they were even more overwhelmed. Therefore, we scaled back. I scaffolded questions to get students thinking analytically and used more demonstrations and examples that were familiar to them. For example, I assigned students different grades, A, B, C, and D, and explained that a capitalist ideology towards grades would mean that each student would get the grade that they earned or received. In a communist society, they would average it out and everyone would get about a B-. Then I asked them to think about who would be happy and who wouldn't be happy about the grade and why. This was one way that I was able to modify and differentiate instruction among my classes. Later, when we watched the videos, The Mad Monk and the Russian Revolution, as well as read an article on the revolution with a reading guide, these ideas were discussed and formatively assessed, reinforcing these ideas. One important lesson I learned was that everything matters. For example, the students had commonly had notes packets provided by my cooperating teacher. Each slide on the PowerPoint had its own sheet. Students would simply fill in the blanks. However, I thought that I would prefer to save paper and made the notes in an outline form. Even though it was the same information, students from my general classes were confused and overwhelmed by the format, often needing me to assist them in locating where we were in the notes. On the other hand, my honor students liked the outline and preferred to keep it the same. Therefore, I realized that even something such as notes can make a difference in the student's ability to recognize and comprehend material. Some students needed visually accurate notes, while some internalized information through auditory learning. Student demographics within my classroom also impacted my classroom management strategies. One of the basic ways that I manage my classroom is by creating procedures. Fortunately for me, my cooperating teacher and I are freakishly similar, and procedures and routines were already implemented to help students stay organized and avoid unnecessary stress that could hinder the atmosphere of the learning environment. For example, each day, students who were absent knew to check in the wall folder labeled for their class in order to find all of their makeup work and instructions. They knew that every Monday they would receive a pink sheet in which they would write down the agenda for the entire week, labeling the assignments that they would have back in their folders graded by the end of the week. Then, on Friday, we had folder checks to ensure that all students had their folders in order and that they had all of the assignments from the pink sheet. Whether or not they were done, students would receive a small grade for having that folder organized. This was to ensure that students had all the necessary materials for exams and quizzes. Also, at the beginning of each unit, the students would take a day to work on the physical geography map, labeling countries, bodies of water, mountains, plains, etc. Then the unit would move through the impact of the physical geography on climate and human settlement, before moving into the history of the region. By creating an environment that is friendly to learning and makes students feel calm and safe, students are less likely to demonstrate undesired behaviors. I am also a firm believer in the classroom management theory and strategies developed by Marvin Marshall. As an educator, my goal is to make learning and instruction effective. The goal is to maintain civil classroom behavior. Civil classroom behavior means that individuals are respectful, polite, cordial, and well-mannered. This is achieved through students demonstrating a high level of responsibility. Responsible, meaning that one pays attention, makes strong effort, and does what is right without being told to do so. Marshall's belief is that students will increase in positive behavior when given more responsibility, as it develops intrinsic motivation rather than extrinsic. The overarching strategy to implementing this theory is by helping students to analyze, reflect on, and adopt personal behaviors that brings them success in school. There are many ways in which I practice this management theory in my classroom. 1, creating procedures, not rules. Procedures are action plans that facilitate the accomplishment of goals. Rather than forcing obedience, it encourages students to do what is right because it will benefit them in the long run. Another strategy used is implementing positive communication. For example, I had students often approach me saying, "Miss, you never gave me that assignment back," even though most of the time it was never submitted or simply lost. I would often encourage them to change the way they approached me, to come to me not as a victim of a circumstance, but as a responsible young adult capable of using appropriate communication skills to either ask questions or find out what they needed in the next step to being successful and getting information they needed. So often I would simply tell them that I am sorry and that if they could turn it into a question, I would have a response for them. This would typically lead to a restorative conversation and the problem would be solved. Another example is instead of saying, "Don't leave your trash on the floor," I would use positive language such as, "We place our trash in the trash can," or "Please place your trash in the trash can." This type of language creates mental images of the appropriate behavior, often encouraging students to practice the appropriate behavior. However, one of the most important strategies included empowering students by giving them choices and teaching students to ask reflective questions that influence students rather than forcing obedience. These experiences will assist me in my professional development moving forward, better equipping me to meet the needs of my students. I have learned the importance of choice and reflection, allowing students to take responsibility for their learning and behavior in order to develop themselves into responsible and informed citizens. I have learned to never assume prior knowledge, but rather to take the time to develop relationships, assess their background knowledge, and connect that knowledge to content material. I have also learned that while I always want to challenge my students, I need to make sure that I am keeping material at grade level to avoid overwhelming students and discouraging them from participating and being engaged. This can be done by simply making sure that I am not using high academic vocabulary that is foreign to my students and avoiding giving students too much new content at once. It is important to clarify expectations, maintain procedures, and establish trust between teachers and students. Always explain the purpose behind the madness. As you gain students' respect and trust, they are more willing to participate because they know that you have their best interests in mind, and that I am not there to waste their time or mine with meaningless work. As I continue to develop as a professional, I will remember and cherish the experiences and lessons I have learned while at Clay High School. Finally, I would like not only to thank you for listening, but thank you for being a part of my academic experience.